Laptop computer spins onto the screen, opens, and displays ATP Education Program webinar series, closes, and then spins off the screen.
Hello, my name is Brian Wojcik. Welcome to this webinar. In this webinar, which is the first of a multi-part series that focuses on quality assistive technology services, we're going to dive deep into the question, what is assistive technology? Let's go ahead and get started. In this webinar, we're going to cover three main areas. First, we're going to talk about a functional definition of assistive technology. And in that definition, it's going to define what it is and what it is used for. Second, we're going to identify a process to provide quality assistive technology services to children and students receiving special education services. Finally, we're going to summarize assistive technology services that are defined in special education law that apply to all students receiving special education services. Let's start with the functional definition of assistive technology. In order for us to do that, we have to ask this very important question. What is an intervention? And the reason that we need to ask that is that in intervention and types of interventions really go to the heart and the purpose of assistive technology. So if we look at what is an intervention, we can say that an intervention is an action or a tool that is designed to purposefully change an individual's behavior or performance. We might be increasing that behavior or that performance or decreasing that behavior or performance. But it's the idea that we are putting something in place, again, whether that be an action or a tool, or sometimes both, and our intent is to change the way an individual performs by the very fact that we have that action or tool taken or put in place. There are two types of interventions that we're going to talk about. The first is an instructional intervention. The second is a compensatory intervention. Let's take a look at that first one now. An instructional intervention is designed to teach a person knowledge or skills that they have not previously attained. How do we measure an instructional intervention? Well, we measure it against previous performance. So we take performance checks and measure that performance at different points in time. And then we're always comparing it to the previous performance to see, is the intervention doing what we want it to do? I'm a data person, so let's take a look at this in graphical form. So here I have a graph, and I'm going to divide this graph into three phases. The baseline, and this is what happens before we start the intervention, and then the withdrawal. The vertical axis is points of performance. In other words, we're looking at those measures of performance taken over time. The horizontal axis are the points in time in which those performance measures have been taken. This solid line represents the goal. This is the desired performance level that we want an individual to perform. So let's put this in terms of an instructional intervention. Again, baseline is the performance before the intervention occurs. And we can see that there is a gap between the baseline performance and the goal where the individual needs to perform. With the intervention, if our goal is to increase performance, if that intervention is successful, we would see a change in that performance from baseline to hopefully approximating where we want the individual to perform. When we withdraw the intervention, in other words, when we stop doing that intervention, The intervention is successful if we see the performance maintain over time, even when the intervention is not in place. This is what we do all the time as teachers, as therapists. We do instructional interventions. We teach a skill, and as we are teaching that skill, the student's performance on that skill becomes better and approximates where we want the student to perform. When we stop teaching the skill, the individual has that skill and is able to perform at that level. A compensatory intervention is different. It is designed to allow a person to do a task that he or she could not otherwise do. When we look at how do we measure whether or not a compensatory intervention is effective, well, performance, like an instructional intervention, is measured against previous performance, but it's also measured against performance when the intervention is not in place. A compensatory intervention often has to be in place for the change in performance to be observed. So, similar, I have a graph. I have those three phases: baseline, intervention, and withdrawal. And I have the vertical axis of that shows measures of performance, and the horizontal axis that shows the points in time that that measurement was taking place. We have that goal line, and just like before, our baseline measurement shows a gap between where the student needs to perform and where the student is currently performing. When we put the intervention in place, we're actually measuring two things. We're measuring performance with the intervention in place, which is represented by this dashed green line. And we can see that the performance increases and approximates where we want the individual to perform over time. But we're also measuring the performance when the intervention is not in place. So we take a look at the dotted line, and we can see that the gap persists, that when the intervention is not in place, that gap continues to be there. So what would happen if we withdraw the intervention? Well, you guessed it, we're going to see that gap continue to persist. This is a compensatory intervention, and we use compensatory interventions all the time. It might be something like an accommodation, where we go ahead and provide a quiet room, or we go ahead and provide extended time on a test. But it can also be different types of tools. Let's take a look at eyeglasses, for example. If I put my eyeglasses on, my performance on visual-based tasks is likely to improve, as long as those eyeglasses are actually for me and they match my diagnosis and my prescription. But when I take those eyeglasses off, my performance on those same visual tasks are likely to go back to baseline level, in that I'm going to have a gap when I'm not using those eyeglasses. So, what is assistive technology? Well, it's either an instructional or a compensatory intervention. And truth be told, it really is a compensatory intervention. Let's go back to those eyeglasses. Eyeglasses are a key example of a type of assistive technology. When we look at eyeglasses, an individual uses the eyeglasses and their performance improves. When they take those eyeglasses off, those eyeglasses can no longer compensate for what difficulties the individual is having, and therefore the individual is unable to perform as well. So, assistive technology is a compensatory intervention. Let's take a look at a legal definition of assistive technology. This definition comes from IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the foundation law that governs special education. This definition states, assistive technology device means any item, piece of equipment, or product system, whether acquired commercially off the shelf, modified or customized, that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of children with disabilities. So when we look at this definition, when we start looking at this definition, it is sometimes a little ambiguous as to what it means. So let's kind of break it down into some of the key components. The first area that we need to focus on is an assistive technology device means any item. This is crucial because it's absolutely important. Assistive technology can literally be anything, as long as it allows an individual to do something that they could not otherwise do. That's part of the definition. It could be anything. We can look at eyeglasses, but I can also look at a pencil holder, or I could look at a wheelchair, or I could look at a communication device, or I could even look at a tennis ball. How can a tennis ball be assistive technology? Well, I can take that tennis ball, poke a pen or a pencil through it, and change the way the individual grips that pen or pencil. That can be assistive technology for an individual. So it can be literally anything. Now, it's also important to note that in 2004, there was a limitation placed on what any item means, meaning that it can be any item, just not something that is surgically implanted. And that was a limitation largely sparked by cochlear implants. Any item, though, still leaves the field pretty open for interpretation. Next piece of equipment or product system. Well, what is a system? We're talking about two or more things working together to function as assistive technology. And sometimes we are using those things concurrently, and sometimes we are using them at different parts of the day for similar reasons. Let me give you an example. If I was using a communication device, but I also needed to use a wheelchair in order to get around, and maybe I had some difficulty actually operating that communication device or operating my wheelchair or both, I might have to use a system of tools in order to help me communicate. So my communication device needs to be attached to my wheelchair. We're going to need a mounting system of some sort. I have difficulty operating that device, so I may need a switch control or something along those lines to give me another way of operating that device because I have difficulty isolating a single finger and pointing, or isolating a knuckle, or maybe my accuracy isn't very good as I try to operate that device. So I'm going to use a different system. So now I have a switch, I have a mount, I have a wheelchair, and I have a communication device all working together. That's a good example of a product system. Another example might be, and I'm going to stick with communication, I may have a primary communication system that I use when I am seated or when I'm in a position where I can go ahead and use this device. But maybe when I'm walking in the hall and I need to engage in quick conversation, I have an alternative system that I use. Maybe a watch-based device that I can go ahead and use to communicate. It's portable, it stays with me, I always have it, and it's not quite as bulky as my primary communication system. So I might use both of those systems together just at different points of the day in order to communicate. That's another example of a product system. Next area, whether acquired commercially, off the shelf, modified, or customized. This is important because 9 times out of 10, when we are thinking about assistive technology, we're not thinking, it's rare to find assistive technology that needs no modifications in order to meet the individual needs of the user. Think about yourself. Many of you probably have a cell phone, right? Well, how many of you have modified that cell phone in some way? Maybe you've added a particular case. Maybe you've changed the background. Maybe you've added apps or changed the functionality in some way, shape, or form of how you interact with that phone. Maybe you've changed the ringtone. Well, you could have done all of these things for a variety of different reasons. One might be to make it more functional. One might be to make it look nicer. One might be to protect it and give it some durability. All of those things could be things that we would have to do to assistive technology as well in order to allow the student to be successful with it. We may need to modify it or customize it in some way that is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities. We're going to focus on those two words, functional capabilities. One of the things that I love about assistive technology is that it can be used across so many different functional domains. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we ask students to do every day to be successful? Well, we ask them to read, write, do math, communicate, walk from place to place, sit, line up, eat, bathroom, play. Well, that's a lot of different things. And I didn't even cover the entire list because we still have things like communicate, see, hear, attend, organize, self-regulate. These are all examples of functional capabilities, and these are all examples of where assistive technology may be needed for a particular student. The most incredible thing about assistive technology is how many different areas it can potentially impact. It is both incredible and it adds a degree of complexity. But the one thing that I want you to keep in mind is assistive technology is always based on the need of the student. We don't think about disability. We don't think about a lot of different things, but we look at what does a student need to do? And that's where the functional capabilities come in play. The final piece, and this is within the context of law, assistive technology needs to be used by a child with a disability. Now, it doesn't say that only children with certain disabilities need assistive technology. It says a child with a disability. The identification of a disability, and therefore the identification in this context of needing special education services, is really where there's that line of demarcation between what is and isn't assistive technology. So it can be any device, but it does need to be used by a child with a disability. For what purpose? That compensatory intervention. It needs to allow them to address one or more of those functional capabilities by allowing them to use this piece of technology in order to increase or improve those functional capabilities in a way that allows them to do something that they could not otherwise do. But it doesn't need to be used by a child with a disability. So let's go back to a couple basics. Simply put, assistive technology allows a student to do a task that he or she could not otherwise do at the expected performance level. The exception to that is surgically implanted devices. The other piece to take a look at here is when we're thinking about assistive technology, we don't lead with the assistive technology. We lead with what does the student need to do? And then we use that as the basis and the fundamental question for determining what assistive technology is needed. Specifically, we make that match between what the student's individual skills, needs, and difficulties and desires are, the activities in which the student needs to engage, the context in which those activities occur, and the features of the potential assistive technology. We use those needs and skills and desires and activities and context to determine what those features are, and then we determine what are potential assistive technologies that can be used by the student. Let's talk about a couple misperceptions that tend to come up with assistive technology. First and foremost, assistive technology is not a magic pill or a silver bullet. It's not a magical solution. We don't provide a child a piece of assistive technology and voila, they no longer have any difficulty. Oftentimes, students need practice with assistive technology. It's an area that they are needing to learn how to use. And it's an area that they might be doing the same task as everybody else around them, but doing it in a slightly different way so that they can be successful. And in doing so, we have to teach the student how to use the assistive technology. And that means we have to know how to use it, and we have to help scaffold the students' learning so that they learn how to use the assistive technology on the task that they need to use it for and in the context they need to use it for. Second, assistive technology might be short-term or it might be long-term. There's really no rules about once an individual is deemed needing assistive technology, that it is something that they're going to use for the rest of their life. We all use assistive technology on short-term basis. For example, how many of us have ever broken an appendage or sprained an ankle, and we ended up using crutches or a wheelchair? Well, in some of our cases, we're probably not using that anymore. So it's a short-term solution. Sometimes assistive technology will be a long-term solution, and it will morph over time. That functional need continues to be there, and we may continually need to come back and reassess, is the assistive technology still working in the way that we need it to in order to help the student be successful in that functional area? And it may be a more long-term solution, and we keep morphing the assistive technology to address that over time. And the final area that it tends to be a huge misperception is assistive technology is really related to the functional needs of the student, not the condition or the diagnosis. Assistive technology is about looking at what does a student need to do, why is a student having difficulty, are there things in the context that are impacting, is it the effects of the student's disability that's impacting, or some other reason, and then using that information to determine what potential assistive technology is needed. That's a lot, but it has nothing to do with what the condition or the diagnosis is. The condition or the diagnosis can inform, but it's not dependent upon it. And what I mean by that is we don't sit there and say, well, there's a class of assistive technologies for kids with learning disabilities, or a class of assistive technology for students with intellectual disabilities. Now, there might be some assistive technologies that tend to be correlated with certain conditions, but the Office of Special Education Programs at the federal level has actually come out very strongly to say there is no predefined set of assistive technologies. And in doing so, we're also saying that there's no predefined set of assistive technologies for any individual disability condition. So let's sum up everything we've talked about. Assistive technology is anything, but it depends on the purpose for which it is used. It needs to be that compensatory intervention. It cannot be surgically implanted. We talked about that as a limitation. So what does that compensatory intervention mean? It means that the assistive technology is going to allow a student to do a task that they could not otherwise do. By definition, assistive technology needs to be used by a student with a disability. And that is the way that it is set up in law. The other piece there is that assistive technology can be a single tool or a system of tools working together in order to meet the functional needs of the student. Within the context of special education, the other piece of determining when a tool becomes assistive technology for a particular student is that it also must be determined to be necessary by the IEP team or the IFSP team. It needs to be necessary for the student to achieve a free, appropriate public education. So the IEP team or IFSP team needs to determine through data collection, through possible trials, through different pieces of information that assistive technology is needed. And once that determination is made, and it meets these other areas, a compensatory intervention, a single tool or a system of tools, allows a student to do something that he or she could not otherwise do. Once that determination is made, then it would be considered assistive technology. Let's go on to another area. I've been alluding to that assistive technology is much more than just the device or systems that we are using. Assistive technology is really couched in process. When we go to an eye doctor, we don't simply show up, the eye doctor pulls something off the wall and says, take these, let me know how they work. We go through a process. There is some data gathering. There's some, what type of issues are you having? There's some testing and some trialing. And then through that process, a pair of glasses or contacts is eventually prescribed. Well, assistive technology is very similar. It has to be within a process. Let's talk about the first step in that process, assistive technology consideration. This is really, is assistive technology needed for a student? Well, that's a very important question. Within the context of an IEP, there's a specific point within the IEP process that this question is overtly asked. Within the context of an IFSP, it is an ongoing question to sit there and say, is assistive technology something that is needed by the child in order to be successful? AT consideration is an important starting point. If the answer is yes, we may go through a process to determine then what assistive technology is needed. Hopefully, we'll have that information already. And we then go on to the provision of the assistive technology. Assistive technology is the primary responsibility when it is determined to be necessary by the IEP or IFSP. It is the primary responsibility of the school district to provide. That is the same within Nebraska for Part B or Part C services, so 0 to 3 services or 3 through 21 services. Once the assistive technology is provided, we then have to plan as to how we're going to implement it. How is it documented within the IEP or the IFSP? What types of plans are there for things like when it breaks down? The one thing we know about technology, it will always break down at some point. So what's our contingency plan? How are we going to get it fixed? We need to think through all this, as well as things like who's going to train the student? Who's going to train the staff? Does everybody know how to use it? And do they also know how to use it within the context of the functional area that the assistive technology is addressing? And then we need to think about the assistive technology assessment and progress monitoring process. Once assistive technology is in place, just like any other intervention, we need to determine, is the assistive technology working? And that's what comes into play here. This is the assistive technology assessment and progress monitoring. Is the assistive technology still working? Is the assistive technology still needed? And based on the answers to those questions, what's the next step? Well, we go back to AT consideration. Now, one thing to consider is that AT consideration, yes, it is a yes or no question for the most part, but it is steeped in its own process and may need to be informed by an evaluation of assistive technology needs. And again, this is the responsibility of the IEP or IFSP team in order to conduct. And in this, we do things like gather and analyze information. We may try different types of assistive technology and gather data on those trials, and then eventually make a determination about the degree to which assistive technology is needed and what assistive technology is needed. This process is essential for creating good matches between a child and assistive technology. The last area that we're going to talk about is how assistive technology services are defined in special education law. We've already looked at the legal definition of assistive technology, and we've broke that definition down to determine what assistive technology is. But there are other pieces in the law that address assistive technology, and we want to talk about how those services are defined. IDEA defines assistive technology services using the language that appears on this slide. Let me go ahead and point out some key areas. One is the evaluation of the needs of the child. This was that evaluation of AT needs piece that we were talking about that informs assistive technology consideration. If assistive technology is needed, then it is the responsibility of the school or district, and the primary responsibility of the school or district, to purchase, lease, or otherwise provide that assistive technology. Once the assistive technology has been selected, then it's the responsibility of the IEP or IFSP team to select, design, fit, customize, adapt, apply, retain, repair, or replace the assistive technology device that was put in place. Assistive technology should never be used in a vacuum. Therefore, it is absolutely important that any use of assistive technology comes along with coordinating that use within the context of therapies, interventions, or services that in the context of where the assistive technology may be used. Finally, training and technical assistance for the child, the family, and the professionals who are working with the child is a necessary component of making sure that assistive technology is going to be effective for the student. The number of times that I have seen assistive technology be selected and then dropped because no one had received the necessary training is far too many to count, unfortunately. So having good training, not only for those who are working with the child, but the family and the child, him or herself, is essential. Another piece that appears in the law is talking about assistive technology within the context of special education. And it states that assistive technology devices and services are made available to children with disability as part of special education services, related services, or supplementary aids and services. This means that assistive technology could be used within the context of those specially designed instructional services that are being provided, related services such as occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech language therapy, or any other therapies that are deemed appropriate by the IEP team, or within the context of supplementary aids and services. And here we're talking about assistive technology within the context of assessments, accommodations, extracurricular activities, other school activities such as field trips or maybe assemblies, or even things like navigating around the school and being a successful part of that school and being able to use the restroom or the locker or those types of things. These are all different areas in which assistive technology may be used. Thank you for joining us in this webinar. Remember that this is just the beginning of the journey. Defining assistive technology is absolutely critical, but it is in the context of a number of other areas that lead to providing high-quality assistive technology services. So please come on back and join us. I'll go ahead and open up the floor to questions. If people have questions, please type them in the chat, or you can go ahead and turn on your microphone and ask your question at that point. I look forward to engaging with you. Have a good one if you're headed out, but I'll stick around for questions. Thanks again.
Thank you for watching. For more information on the ATP education program, please visit our website at atp.nebraska.gov/education or email us at atp.education@nebraska.gov.